Welcome to Hack Your HazCom. In today's episode, I have my good friend Gene Sanders here with over 25 years of extensive exposure working with dangerous goods in pharmaceutical, safety supplies, chemical, educational, waste, and clinical trials environments. Gene is extremely knowledgeable in DOT, ICAO, IMO, TDG, and ADR. We'll get into what all those interesting acronyms mean as we discuss today. He's one of the first of three people in the world to become a certified dangerous goods trainer in 5 different sets of transport regulations. He's worked for carriers and for shippers dealing with proposed products, with new products, and with waste involving chemicals and involving articles, handling outgoing shipments, and dealing with returns on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Gene has been on a hazardous materials emergency response team and on a volunteer fire department. Gene has developed and conducted training programs, primarily for shippers, involving some aspect of all hazard classes and divisions, including Class 1, Division 6.2, and Class 7, with degrees in biochemistry and in chemistry, and a minor in microbiology. Gene regularly teaches in-depth, detailed courses in classification and in infectious substances, as well as teaching more comprehensive classes involving all aspects of dangerous goods, shipping, offering, and accepting. Gene now runs his own classification, training, and consulting company, Retraining Consulting. Welcome, Gene. How are you today?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good. It's an honor to be on any podcast that's hacking ways to
Well,
compliance.
it's a pleasure to have you too, and I'm excited to tap into your exhaustive knowledge base here, and let's get right to it. So, the reason I've had you on today, I wanted to discuss. We get this all the time in our world with compliance with both the GHS and various transportation requirements all over the world and transport and by different modes of shipping. One thing we ask is we try to find out what we can do to better mesh any disagreements that come by, discrepancies that come. So I figured you'd be an excellent source. So let's get into this today. First off, let's talk about in the US, we certainly know that OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, covers workplaces, and through that, it's the hazard communication standards for employees, employers, developing the SDS and all of that. With that, in the SDS, you have a section on transportation, which is quite important and potentially a source of consternation with all those using the SDS. I'd love to hear from you what agencies in the U.S. are involved with the shipment of hazardous materials and using various transports, and are there any differences between those agencies?
Um, Basically, in the United States, there is one regulatory agency. It's the
Mm-hmm.
Department of Transportation. There's a small group within the DOT, the Department of Transportation, that puts out the rules for what we call hazardous materials. Now, in the United States, we call things that are being transported that might be bad
Mm-hmm.
hazardous materials because they're hazardous. The rest of the world recognizes that hazardous materials and hazardous waste and hazardous substances and hazardous chemicals might not all be the same thing. And in fact, they can be 4 different things here in the US, and that causes confusion. Perhaps that's why you thought this was an appropriate topic for a podcast, because people do get confused about it. So outside the US, instead of calling them hazardous materials, we call them dangerous goods. Okay? Things being shipped around, somebody's getting paid to do it. Good seems a reasonable term. Dangerous instead of hazardous kind of means the same thing, but dangerous stands out. So within the US, you can use the DOT hazardous materials, or hazmat for short, regulations. They're ensconced in part of 49 CFR. So if you hear people say 49 CFR, they're generally talking about the rules for transporting hazardous materials. Sometimes they'll say CFR 49, sometimes they'll just say DOT regulations. they're probably not really experienced in it if they say DOT regulations, because nobody that does it for a long time still calls them DOT. But they're all the same thing. And DOT, excuse me, and FIMS in particular, are the ones that have this authority. Now, they can be enforced by different modes. So the Federal Highway Safety Administration can enforce hazmat rules by road. The FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, can enforce them for airplane shipments, including the ground before or after the shipment. The Coast Guard enforces them. Coast Guard is no longer part of DOT, but used to be, for ocean shipments, and the FRA, Federal Railroad Administration, for rail shipments. But they're not the only people that can write rules that people use to ship hazmat in the U.S. Because so many companies that do domestic shipping also do international shipping. It's really nice to have things as harmonized as possible. Okay, they're not totally harmonized between these different modes or agencies, but internationally, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, writes rules about shipping things by air internationally. And the US allows you to use ICAO regulations with some conditions and restrictions, because the US has some extra things in their regulations ICAO doesn't. But in general, you can use ICAO regulations to ship by air in the United States. ICAO's regulations are kind of a pain to use, a pain to teach, a little bit difficult. So a bunch of air carriers got together years ago um, and said, we can make these regulations user friendly. ICAO works with this group, International Air Transport Association, the acronym IATA, we usually pronounce IATA. IATA and ICAO work together, and they put out a much more user-friendly set of regulations. So when shipping domestically in the U.S. by air, you can choose to use the 49 CFR, or you can choose to use IATA. If you're going to ship internationally by air, you almost always have to use IATA. So a lot of companies, like FedEx, for all their domestic shipments, they'll use IATA. That way they use one set of regulations. Doesn't matter whether it's domestic or international. They're just good to go either way. UPS, they're happy to use DOT regulations domestically. They're happy to use IATA. So they can use either one. If it comes to international ocean shipments, it's a similar situation. The IMO, International Maritime Organization, puts out the IMDG code, International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code. And you can use that for domestic ocean or water shipments in the U.S., or you can use the 49 CFR. For your international water shipments, it's going to be the IMDG code. And then we have arrangements with Canada that if they're shipping something into the U.S., generally we allow it using the TDG, Transport of Dangerous Goods regulations from Canada, into the U.S. We like that because that allows them to give us reciprocity. And so U.S. shippers that are shipping to Canada like the idea that they don't have to learn the TDG regulations. Once it's received in Canada at, say, a distribution point or a warehouse or a hub or something, then they'll, before they reship it out, have to reclassify it and use the TDG regulations. They're Canadian and they know how to use them.
All right. That's quite a great description of all the various complications and, touching upon the harmonization. We get this all the time in the globally harmonized system that we use for workplace classification. Very interesting that it's similar in the transportation world, and as well as the differences in philosophies or between OSHA and here in the U.S. the or the DOT, Department of Transportation. Specifically, what do you know about, or could you touch upon what philosophically these two agencies have regarding their approach to risk management?
Well, it's interesting to use the word philosophically because I don't think of philosophers at either place, at OSHA or at PHMSA, the part of DOT that sets the regulations. But philosophically, there can be a huge difference, or there is a huge difference in how they handle workplace safety in general, okay, at OSHA versus transportation safety at DOT. And the difference is that when it comes to deciding what measures are put in place in a warehouse or manufacturing facility, there are rules that require the people working at that warehouse or manufacturing facility to determine what the hazards are, determine what the chances of them happening are, which hazard times, the chance of occurrence gives you risk, and then manage that risk. Put procedures and processes and training in place
Mm-hmm.
to minimize the risk. So you have to have safety management systems or programs all designed at the people that are being regulated, minimizing the risk. When it comes to transportation, DOT says, forget that. Uh-uh. We'll do it for you. If you look in the 49 CFR, the definition of what's a hazardous material, they tell you there are things that the Secretary of Transportation, of course, it's not the Secretary, him or herself,
Mm-hmm.
it's delegated down. The Department of Transportation will tell you what's an acceptable or reasonable amount of risk. You, the regulated community, me as a shipper, me as a carrier, me as, package manufacturer, whatever, we don't get to decide. We do basically what they tell us. Fortunately, they often give us options, but they have decided what's an appropriate level of risk. This can be extremely disconcerting for people that have worked their whole life in OSHA or workplace safety in other places, Canada or Europe, who get later on in their professional career some transport responsibilities because they're used to deciding, oh, well, this is a small enough amount that if it gets out, it's not going to be a problem. And so we're going to just put this in a plain brown box. That's not the way it
Mm-hmm.
works in transport. They have smaller quantity exceptions. They have things called accepted quantities. They've got limited quantities. Um, and the rules are relaxed, a little bit easier for those. But there are other things you may have to do, like increase the packaging, as well as making sure that the quantity is limited. You may have to communicate that in some specific way. You don't just get to decide it's a small amount, the risk is low enough because if somebody gets exposed, there's not a whole lot there. Okay, if a fire starts, it's going to be burned out almost immediately. You don't get to make those decisions. You were used to making those decisions if you were a workplace safety professional for years and
Mm-hmm.
years, maybe decades. And now that is taken away from you. So the philosophy of risk management is very, very different between the two agencies, especially for workplace safety. It's a little less so when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
writing safety data sheets. I mean, in both cases, they tell you what the criteria are, and then you get to do your classifications, write your conclusions, fill out, your sheets, fill out your shipping documents. So it's that philosophical difference is a little less pronounced between safety data sheets and their preparation
Mm-hmm.
and transport. However, a lot of people think GHS, globally harmonized, and they work with. They're a sister subcommittee at the UN with the transport folks. If I know GHS, I can
Right.
classify for transport. That's horrendously wrong.
That's a bit of bad news
Right?
right there, right? So, absolutely, for what we do in this world, let's carry on. What go on about the point you're making?
Okay. Well, so GHS used,
Yep.
and we may want to
Sure.
edit that little snip. GHS used the definitions in transport as a starting point when they created GHS. So for health hazards, they kind of went, well, transport, we'll do pretty much our own thing. We'll look at yours and think about what to do. But for physical hazards, we'll just
Mm-hmm.
take your definitions. And then they went off and running. We've had GHS and however many iterations we have now. I'm not sure what revision we're on at this point, but it's a bunch of them, more than I can count on one hand. So, because they started using similar definitions, so many people think, well, if I can get the conclusion from going through the GHS process regarding a hazard, I'm going to be able to match that up to a conclusion for transport. That often works, but it often doesn't, because transport, having been around for more than 7 or 8 revisions every 2 years, has been around for 70 years probably, writing these kinds of regulations. And we have lots and lots of differences, lots of times when the strict criteria for a material are not the only factor in classification. Let me give you just one example, kind of off the top of my head. If you had a gas and you were going to use this gas for, well, let's talk about poop freeze, because it's a fun thing that makes classes interesting. Poop freeze looks like an aerosol. It's an aerosol canister. And if you have a dog and the dog needs to poop and you don't have your own yard, you have to walk out in public, when your dog poops, you got to pick it up. Not difficult if your dog is normally healthy. But let's suppose your dog ate something it shouldn't. I mean, we've all heard a dog eating something it shouldn't, right? And the poop is a little bit runny. You whip out your little aerosol can of poop freeze and you spray it on the poop. As the gas comes out of the can, it expands. When the gas expands, it absorbs heat from the surroundings and it freezes the dog's poop. Frozen poop is much easier to pick up. The people that give out tickets for, not picking up after your dog are very happy with you. Everybody's happy. What if you wrote a safety data sheet for that gas? Because somebody somewhere is putting that gas in those aerosol containers. Okay? You determine whether that gas is toxic. You determine whether that gas is flammable. And you write your safety data sheet. You come to your conclusions. Does it matter in your safety data sheet what kind of container I put it in? I don't think so. Doesn't really matter. However, for transport, we have a set of classifications for aerosols. We have different packaging tests for aerosols than we do for cylinders, and different transport classifications. When we classify something for transport, we give it a proper shipping name. There's a limited list of those. There may be thousands, but still limited. And with each one comes a number so that it can be translated into any different language. So UN 1950, it doesn't matter whether you're Swedish or Greek or English or Portuguese or whatever, even in Chinese, UN 1950 means aerosols. And that's what we call it, aerosols, when it's in the aerosol can. But what about the company that makes this poop freeze? Where do they get their gas? They get it in big cylinders from an industrial gas supplier. Those people put it in cylinders. The proper shipping name for the cylinders is not aerosols, because they're not aerosol containers. They're in cylinders. The proper shipping name is generally going to be the name of the gas, like 1112 tetrafluoroethane, with some other UN number, like UN 1234. So it's the same gas with the same properties in two different kinds of containers. Does that change anything in sections 1 through 13 or 15 and 16 in the safety data sheet? No, I don't think so. Does it change section 14? Absolutely. So the type of package that you put it in can change its classification. You tell me, does that mean that transport and safety data sheets are harmonized in terms of how we get our classification?
It depends, right?
Answer is yeah, exactly. It depends. Much of the time it is, but lots of the times it isn't. Let's talk, as long as we're talking about packaging, let's talk briefly about radioactive. A lot of people don't deal with radioactive. We'll be quick about this. The classification for a radioactive material depends on the type of package you put it in. You put it in a stronger packaging, less radioactivity comes through. You put less of it in there, you get a different classification than if you have more radioactivity in there. And the type of package you put it in and how much radioactivity comes out of the package, how successful it is, can change the overall classification of it. You want to break down a package that was very difficult to ship because nobody wanted that much radioactivity in one package. They're not going to take your type C or your type B package. Well, if you break it down into 24 or 100 smaller packages, each with a smaller amount of radioactivity, you get to change your classification, and all of a sudden they take your stuff. Whether you put it in one package or 100 packages has a huge effect on the classification. But it's the same safety data sheet for that material, whether it's one package or 100 of them.
Right.
Who knew?
Right.
Well, if you didn't before this podcast, you're learning now, I hope.
Thankfully so, yes. So, you touched a bit upon this with GHS, SDS conclusions, warnings, pictograms, and the like. Should these be the end all for DOT hazard classification?
Well, they should be a starting point. Let's talk about toxicity. If you look at oral toxicity, your GHS conclusions map up directly to oral toxicity conclusions for transport. Yay, that's the way we like it. It is global, it is harmonized, wonderful. Same for dermal. The same for inhalation of dusts or mists. Now, a dust is a solid in the air, and a mist is a liquid in the air, and gravity pulls them out of the air. They don't stay there long. All you really need to be concerned about is the LC50 for the dust or the mist, and that's the transport handles it, and that's the way that SDS regulations handle it. OSHA handles it. Let's talk about inhalation of vapors. Inhalation of vapors, when you're writing a safety data sheet, you look at what the LC50 is. It tells you what the various classifications could be. You assign the appropriate classification. There you are, you're done. For transport, it works differently. Let's take 3 different gases, just call them A, B, and C for right now, that all have the same LC50. They all get the same classification in the safety data sheet. They're all considered equally toxic. For transport, they're worried about, well, what happens if this stuff spills? See, for inhalation of vapors, it's not the liquid itself that's the issue. It's the vapor, the gas that comes out of that liquid that we worry about. What if the first liquid, A, sits there on the tarmac at the airport where it was spilled, or the apron, of the hub at the railway or truck station, and it just sits there like it's motor oil. And over the course of 2 years, it eventually evaporates. How much of that vapor do we have in the air? Now, it's toxic vapor, but there's so little of it because it's so not volatile.
Right.
It's not really a problem. And probably shouldn't be regulated as a poison. On the other hand, what if it's like, say, acetone? By the time you pour it out on the benchtop in the laboratory, you just watch it, it evaporates almost immediately. There it goes. Full ether. If you took, say, number C, same LC50 as A, that we're not going to regulate because it doesn't volatilize, but it has a vapor pressure like ethyl ether or acetone, it's going to leap out of that puddle into the air as a vapor. It's going to spread out. Gravity won't pull it down. The wind can blow it anywhere, and people are going to be dropping like flies. So we're going to give it some of the most severe classifications. What if the volatility is somewhere in between, like water on a sidewalk after the rain? Maybe you get a mild poison classification, not one that requires evacuation. You could get 3 different transport classifications for A, B, and C. A being not regulated, C being very, very regulated, and somewhere in between for B, based on its volatility, its vapor pressure. What safety data sheet say about those? Safety data sheet says, well, they all have an LC50 to make them toxic, with the skull and crossbones warning. When you get the skull and crossbones warning on the safety data sheet and you're shipping A, and somebody wants to check your classification because you're moving that stuff around, and they look at it, you got a skull and crossbones pictogram, but you don't have a skull and crossbones transport for it,
Right.
they hold up your shipments because people don't know that there are these differences between transport and the GHS criteria that are used in
Right.
safety data sheets. So if you're going to be a safety data sheet author, do you think you should be allowed to fill out section
Good
14?
question. I mean, we get this all the time, and with the recent update, this brings up a great point. The GHS just got updated in the US as of today's recording, and we are in process of having to account for what's called known and anticipated and reasonably anticipated uses of all of the different downstream uses of your product, right? This brings up an excellent example of why an SDS author or anyone that's responsible for what goes into the sheet, how are you going to have to know the entirety of these downstream uses, right? One clue is the physical properties. Can you determine how it's being stored and the reasonably stored uses or anticipated workplace scenarios that your end user is going to have? I'm hoping so. OSHA received tons of questions and we're waiting on letters of interpretation. OSHA, when they first introduced this revised scenario in their preamble, they said that this already existed when GHS was adopted in the US. It's just now being reemphasized. Not only that, they want to see these different uses identified in Section 2. Can you just imagine if I'm dealing with a commodity chemical that's got thousands of uses? The first question we asked OSHA, well, what does that mean? 1,000 different uses in Section 2? They said, be reasonable about it. And there's that magic word, reasonable. I imagine that comes up in your line of work with transportation all the time. I'm glad you brought this up, but I think listeners today have to keep this in mind. We get this all the time, like you mentioned with that crazy looking pictogram in Section 2. How come we're not saying anything about it in Section 14? This is the conundrum we face. So I'm glad to have you here, but continue on. Let's hear more about what we run into with this stuff.
I think you should know that when I go to some place like an SCHC, Society for Chemical Hazard Communication, I talk to people there, and you deal with these
Sure.
complications all the time. And it makes your job seem to me like it's so incredibly complicated and difficult. There's no way I want to do that. You know, I can become a registered SDS author, training it. Oh no, that's way too complex for me. What I usually get back is, well, wait a minute. You tell us about differences in transport classifications, where the destination can make a difference, the use difference, what mode you put it in makes a difference, whether there are other hazards or not. You have the complicated job, Gene. And so apparently each of us thinks that what the other does is pretty damn difficult and complicated.
Absolutely.
Well, so let's talk about some more differences between just GHS classifications, which are basically the intrinsic properties of the material, versus what transport looks for. And see if I can convince you that I'm right when I tell you that my belief is that anybody who fills out section 14 of a safety data sheet should have transport classification training. I think it's different enough that it should be a
Right.
requirement. Now, when it comes to safety data sheets in the US, nobody's going to enforce that.
Right.
You can write anything you want in section 14 of a safety data sheet as long as you have one. You can say, go take a flying leap. And OSHA's not going to be able to fine you for that because they have no authority over
Right.
transportation. You can just say, figure it out
Right.
yourself.
Right.
Or you can put something that's clearly wrong. You can call a liquid a gas proper
Mm-hmm.
shipping name. You can call something that's flammable as an oxidizer, but not say
Right.
that it's flammable or anything. And OSHA can't do anything about it. So you go, oh, well, yeah, but DOT will. DOT's point of view is that's an OSHA document. We have no
Right.
authority over it. You write
Right.
anything you want to know, as wrong as you want to be. And so, is anybody going to enforce this?
Sure.
Probably not. Now, where can enforcement take place? If you ship something that's wrong and DOT catches it as it ships out, and they're going to blame it on the safety data sheet. Well, all I did was took the classification from the safety data sheet. DOT can't say the data sheet author, but they can get the people that
Hmm.
shipped it wrong. We're going to go back to the people that provided them the safety data sheet, and maybe through a lawsuit, work their way backwards and say, you were inaccurate, you needed to be accurate. But it's not going to happen through direct enforcement. It's only going to happen because, one, we care to get it right. Whether we're dealing with your complicated set of regulations or we're dealing with my complicated set of regulations, we're all safety professionals. We're trying to keep people safe. We're trying to make the world a better place. So, and my point of view is if somebody, whether they're a registered SDS author or not, is going to fill out Section 14, they should be trained in transport
Tell us.
regulations, particularly the
Yeah,
classification
exactly. So
stuff.
here's a good spot where we can talk about the training requirements by the different agencies, by modes of transportation. What are those, and how often should somebody be trained, and who should be trained? Those are described, right, in the regulations.
Yeah, the DOT is probably the best in the world at saying this in a few words. They require function specific training, which boils down to you do a function, you have to be trained to right. You don't do a function,
Hmm.
you don't have to worry about it. So if you're an SDS author, there are plenty of rules about putting placards on rail cars or containers that are going to be loaded onto ships. Do you need to be trained in placarding? Well, if you're going to write down information about which placards are required in your safety data sheet, yes. But if you're not putting anything about placards in
Right.
there, no, you don't have to be trained in it. You get trained in what you do. If your job is identifying hazards, picking the most appropriate proper shipping names. If you're going to choose between aerosols as a proper shipping name and 1112 tetrafluoroethane as a proper shipping name, because they both have that same gas in the container, well, then you need to be trained in how to do that, make that distinction properly and
Hmm.
correctly.
Hmm.
That's it. How often? The DOT will, used to be 2 years. And they were convinced by a bunch of shippers and carriers that that's just too often. Let's do it every 3 years. But 2 years is a reasonable thing because every 2 years is how often a new set of international ocean regulations come out. It's how often a new set of international air regulations come out. And since most of the air shipment in the US is done through those international regulations, just for convenience and uniformity, it's not a bad idea to make the training every
Hmm.
2 years. But when you do those retrainings, do they need to be as long as the initial training? Probably not. If you've been using your skills over the previous 2 years, maybe your retraining is just on
Right.
what's changed. And if 85 to 98% of it is the same, then there's 85 to 90% of that stuff you don't need to be trained on again. You get trained on that 2 to 15% that's different. And so it doesn't need to be onerous, but yes, it does need to be periodic. Can't be more than 3 years. Probably should be
Okay.
every 2 years.
Good to know. Good to know. Thank you for that. And I'm sure there are sources we can look back. Listeners can check out biography that's available on our website, hackyourhascom.com, for Gene's contact information as well as sources for where you can find that sort of training. But moving on, we talk again back to the classifications and the GHS and how it may or may not combine or play nicely with transportation rules. You were getting onto some points here as part as the things like mode of transportation, the use of the packaging, how that can affect things. Would you care to go on about some other different types of factors that can play into this?
Well, let's talk about
Okay.
mode of transportation. Okay. Suppose you have a material that is nasty smelling. Some mercaptan or something else that has a sulfur. You breathe it, you throw up. You breathe it, you get sick to your stomach. It has the most common
Right.
word I see is stench, but it's pretty irritating
Right.
to your system. Um, if this material is carried in the back of a truck and it gets loose, and the truck driver feels his or her stomach lurching and is worried about, impending getting,
Mm-hmm.
sick, vomiting, what do? They roll down the
Right.
window, get some fresh air. Hopefully that makes the problem go away. If that doesn't work, they finish driving through the tunnel they're in or over the bridge they're on. They pull off on the side of the road. They hop out of the
Mm-hmm.
truck and they puke. How many lives were put at risk? None. How much damage was done to equipment, transport vehicles, the general public? None. Now, the grass may not like it, but next time it rains, minimal damage, an acceptable, reasonable risk in transport. But what if that same thing happens
Right.
on an airplane and the stuff gets loose and the pilots start smelling it? Now, can the pilot roll down the window in the airplane
No.
anymore? Probably not. Snoopy and the Sopwith Camels, that kind of stuff back to World War II. No, they can't roll down the
Mm-hmm.
window and get fresh air. What if they start throwing up while they're trying to land the plane? I'm told there's not much more gross for an airline pilot than putting on an oxygen mask and
Oof.
throwing up in it.
Yeah.
That's pretty gross. But maybe you put the oxygen mask on. It's a major FAA investigatable incident every single time a pilot needs
Oh wow.
an oxygen mask. It's
Mm-hmm.
a huge deal. And oxygen mask or not, if the pilot makes a mistake landing the plane because they're throwing up, is it easier or harder to land a plane while barfing versus not? If they have a problem, can they put their lives and the lives of other people in the plane at risk?
Yeah.
Yes. Even if it's just a cargo plane, there's
Right.
still a co pilot. And how expensive are airplanes if they wreck this plane while landing it? It's a huge deal. So a stench material can be regulated for air transport, but not for road,
Mm-hmm.
rail, or ocean. So different modes, different transport classifications. Well, that's pretty easy to deal with, I'm told. We'll just give you IATA classifications, IMDG classifications, DOT classifications, and Canada classifications, TDG. Or if we're in Europe, we'll include ADR or appropriate other sets of regulations. And we'll separate things out by mode, and we can do that. That's great. And that works. Maybe that's something you need to do. Maybe your section 14 isn't big enough, needs to be expanded for all the different modes. That's a possibility. Okay. Now for the fun part. What warning do you put in your safety data sheet about the stench? Possibility of
Right.
losing your lunch.
Right.
There isn't one. What do shippers do? How bad does the stench have to be regulated? And the trouble is, in the transport regulations, there are no objective criteria. It's subjective.
Right.
You choose.
Right.
Now, fear of lawsuits
Yep.
manages a lot of this. If you think somebody's going to throw up, you're going to regulate it, aviation regulated. If you're not worried about it and you're worried about saving money and you don't think it's going to happen,
Right.
then maybe you don't regulate it. It's subjective. Now, if it ever happens and you didn't
Right.
regulate it, you're in deep trouble. Now, what if you work in a warehouse where you ship um, most of your stuff by ground, but maybe a third of it by air? Maybe you have a stench product and you work in an area where it's hard to find good employees. It's hard to find people who will accept warehouse wages that
Mm-hmm.
are smart and understand complicated differences and are willing to pay a lot of attention to detail and notice the difference. If you have one of these materials, what's your classification for ground shipment? If you decide that you're going to make it non-ready for ground because it doesn't have to be regulated for ground
Mm-hmm.
shipment, then at least 1/3 of your shipments, you need somebody to recognize I've been putting this on the trucks as non-regulated on a regular
Right.
basis. Now a truck is coming to pick it up and take it to an airport. I need to recognize the difference between these trucks. I need to recognize for air shipment, my classification is different, and I need to call it aviation regulated, liquid or solid, and all the other things that go along with it being a
Mm-hmm.
regulated material. If I don't do that, I've introduced an undeclared dangerous good into the air shipping system. And shipping regulated stuff is undeclared. It's about as bad
Mm-hmm.
as you can do. And the hammer
Right.
can come down. So, what do some shippers do? They say, well, let's just use one classification regardless of mode. If I want to, I can take aviation regulated liquids and I can regulate them for truck
Mm-hmm.
shipment. It's an option. I don't have to, but I can. So, what's my correct shipment classification put in the DOT section of 14 for an aviation regulated liquid or solid?
Good question.
Well, it depends on the philosophy of the
Right.
people shipping it. If I want to have one classification for all my people, and I'm willing to pay a little bit more in shipping fees for truck to not have a violation, then maybe I put aviation regulated liquid. But maybe if I've got long-time employees that are really, really good at this, maybe if I've got systems in place, they're going to flash things up on a screen depending upon what carrier was chosen before the order came down to the floor. Then maybe it tells them on the screen what the classification is, and I make it non-regulated for ground. That's when I want my section 14. How many times, Atanu, do you or other people you know that write safety data sheets, you're filling out section 14 and you get an optional classification? How many times do you call the customer and say, I need to talk to people at the warehouse and find out what you're going to do?
Hardly ever, if ever. Infinitesimal.
Okay, well, maybe things will change now that you have to know what uses anybody
Right.
else could put to
Right.
things. But, right, so it doesn't happen. So transport
Mm-hmm.
classifications vary subjectively instead of objectively, but all the criteria that I know of in GHS, or virtually every single one of them, are objective. So now we have subjective criteria and we have options. I could do it, but I don't have to do it for transport. Let's take this even a little bit further. The United States doesn't like criteria for determining
Mm-hmm.
environmental hazards. Their kind of belief is if you regulate it because it's flammable, or you regulated it because it's corrosive, or you regulated it because it's self-heating, or explosive or radioactive or whatever, it's probably bad for the
Mm-hmm.
environment when it gets loose. They would not be at all unhappy if you said everything that's dangerous, good, or a hazmat is not good for the environment. They don't like criteria. So they didn't adopt them. Not a big deal for all those things that are already regulated, but what happened in the rest of the world when they adopted these criteria is a whole bunch of things that weren't dangerous goods before are now
Mm-hmm.
dangerous goods. Put into miscellaneous class 9, environmentally hazardous, solid, and regulated when they used to just be stuff. Costs some more money, warns people about protecting the environment. The U.S. said, we're not going to do that. So the U.S. has old ways of recognizing environmental hazards. They have two
Mm-hmm.
lists of things. One is the hazardous substance list and the associated reportable quantity, or RQ. They're all things that are
You're right.
bad for the environment. You ship, an ingredient below the RQ, you don't have to identify it. You ship it above its reportable quantity. All of a sudden, if there are no other hazards, you're going to regulate it, ship it as environmentally hazardous. The U.S. does have some environmental hazard regulation. We have a marine pollutant list that
Mm-hmm.
works similarly, just without the quantities. Okay. If something is not on the RQ or the marine pollutant list, no other hazards, the U.S. is perfectly happy with you shipping it non-regulated. if a company is only shipping domestically, that's a real easy classification,
Right.
non-regulated. But what if this company ships internationally? If the criteria say it's environmentally hazardous, it's acute 1, chronic 1, or chronic 2, then in the rest of the world, even though there are no other hazards to it, you're going to regulate it as environmentally hazardous. In the U.S., you don't have to. You get the same kind of situation we were talking about with the aviation regulator. What if you're a shipper that does domestic and international? So the U.S. does allow you, if you want, to call it environmentally hazardous. But you don't have to. What do you put in Section 14? What do you put in Section 14 if a material has no other hazards, okay, but it's got an ingredient that's on the RQ list? Okay, the RQ list works if it's on the list and you ship that ingredient above that quantity. Now, it pays no attention to all the other ingredients. Okay, suppose your 5-gallon can of this material has little enough of that ingredient that it doesn't trigger the RQ, but your 55-gallon drum does. When you ship it in the 55-gallon drum, you absolutely positively have to regulate it, and you have to put RQ on the package and on the shipping papers. No choice, no options. When you ship it in the 5-gallon size, well, you could call it environmentally hazardous if you wanted to, but you still can't put RQ on it, and you still can't put RQ on the shipping papers because it's not an RQ. There's no flexibility about that. One way or another, your 55-gallon drum gets RQ, and your 5-gallon drum doesn't. One way or another, shipping paper for the 55-gallon drum has RQ for reportable quantity, means it's hazardous substance, but your shipping paper for the 5-gallon drum doesn't. How many different safety data sheets do you write for one material?
Impossible. And that's, you're absolutely...
You want to write a safety data sheet for the 5-gallon size versus the 55-gallon? That'd be one way to make Section 14 accurate. But that doesn't tend to happen. So there are choices that are made, but there's a huge difference there between, is this shipment to, from, or within the United States, or is it totally out there in the rest of the world with no U.S. involvement whatsoever?
Quite complex.
So destination, if you're writing safety data sheets for a company in Europe and you're never going to ship to the U.S., you never have to worry about RQs. But if you're going to ship to the U.S., do you have to worry about RQs? Do you have to know about them? Absolutely. How many people that are writing safety data sheets for European companies get trained in, well, if the material's going to the U.S., I have to train you in their transport regulations?
No.
Probably didn't happen.
It's all business decisions. Right.
Right. Does mode of transport make difference in other ways? One of the nickel batteries, I think it's nickel metal hydride, could possibly be nickel cadmium batteries, but nickel metal hydride batteries, not regulated on airplanes, not regulated on trains, not regulated on trucks, but the ocean people had an issue with a pallet of these batteries, and they don't want it repeated. They don't want to lose any ships or anything, so they regulate these batteries only by ocean and only in pallet quantity. The 1, 2, or a dozen of these things replacing batteries is not regulated. You get a whole pallet of them, they are regulated. Well, I guess this isn't appropriate for this discussion, because if it's an article, you don't have to write a safety data sheet for it, right? I mean, I've heard rumors that maybe OSHA's going to require safety data sheets for certain batteries. We'll see. But for the moment, we can put this aside. Let's talk about chemicals and their hazards. Some things are self-heating. They get hot on their own, hot enough to maybe set themselves on fire, hot enough to maybe set other stuff on fire. Been a number of well-known industrial accidents involving these self-heating materials. When you look at the criteria for determining that something's self-heating, depending upon how self-heating it is or isn't, it might be regulated in certain sizes as self-heating 4.2 material. That's a division for transportation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But in lesser quantities,
Uh-huh.
not regulated. So if your cutoff is 3 cubic meters and you're shipping this thing in portable tanks or you're putting it in, vessels or rail cars, it's going to be regulated. You put in a 55-gallon drum
Mm-hmm.
to ship it, not regulated. What's the difference? Quantity, size. Any other differences? No, it's same stuff. Same incompatibilities,
Right.
same GHS hazards. What do you put in section 14? What if, and again, the US has more strict regulations than most of the rest of the world, okay? What if it's a combustible liquid? It's
Mm-hmm.
not a flammable liquid, okay? Let's say it has no other hazards, but its flash point is above that regulated as a flammable liquid for GHS. It's in the combustible
Right.
liquid range. It's close to it, not too hot. In the United States, you must regulate those liquids in bulk, quantities above 450
Mm-hmm.
liters per container. But you don't have to regulate them on bulk.
Hmm.
It's the general rule. If you're writing a safety data sheet for something with a flash point 61 degrees C, what's the cutoff to be regulated as a flammable liquid? What's the cutoff for the appropriate category in
Mm-hmm.
GHS? 6. Above 61 gets a different GHS classification, and in the US, may get a different transport classification. It may make it
Right.
combustible liquid. So, what do you put in section 14? Well, not regulated in quantities less than 450 liters per container, regulated as this classification if more than 450 liters per container. And how do you explain that? What if I have 55-gallon drums? 55-gallon drums, about 208 to 209 liters, each drum individually
Mm-hmm.
not regulated. If I put them all together on a pallet and I get 6 of these drums on a pallet, the total on the pallet's more than
Right.
450 liters. Does that 450 liters kick in or not kick in? The answer is no, it doesn't. This is per package. But how do you explain that in section 14 of the safety data sheet, where the size, the amount that you ship, determines classification? But it's not really the amount you ship that determines classification. It's the amount that you put in any one
Packets. Okay.
package.
Is that? Are you able?
Okay? Is that
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
Nope.
Are you able to make that distinction with in your shipping paper versus the SDS? Right? Can you describe this better in a shipping paper?
I know that there are lots of people that deal with this issue, particularly if they have
Mm-hmm.
different sizes, with their own separate database for transport classifications. And safety data sheets are something that get emailed out or snail mailed out or whatever, provided as required, and the transport
Mm.
people never see them. For those kinds of customers, whether it's combustible liquid or not, it's pretty easy. The 55-gallon drum says it's not regulated, yet the tote, the intermediate bulk container says, yeah, regulate combustible liquid. And so, because they have different entries in their database for different sizes, different product codes, they may even separate them
Mm.
out by destination. It's less of a problem. But for every one of those kinds of customers that I have, there's probably 8 or 10 of them that use their safety data sheet as their transport repository
Right.
for a classification. And those are the ones where we
Yep.
have lots and lots of trouble. There is a company, big company. I don't know if they still do it, so I don't
Sure.
necessarily want to give you the name. But they used to do this, and I think they still do it. I'm just not 100% sure. They write in section 14,
Mm-hmm.
call this number for transport classifications. And when you call that number, they have their own separate database with all the permutations built in, And they will ask you, where are you shipping this to? Where are you shipping it from? What is the container that you're going to use? How many of these containers do you have? And then, boom, they'll tell you what they believe the transportation classification should be.
Oh, interesting. So it runs through like an algorithm or something, if then type statements, right?
Yeah. Well, they have a person that's putting
Sure.
that information in there. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And that makes sense. I mean, certainly from the SDS authoring world, you're not, again, you're being asked to encompass all sorts of downstream uses here. This is exactly it. This is the real world hitting Section 14, right?
Yep. Now, if you're that company and sales drop off a little bit and you start looking for efficiencies, who can you cut? If employees are drawing a salary for something, maybe you put in there, you say, this material might or might not be regulated depending upon the size, depending upon the container, depending upon the destination, depending upon the
Right.
use, depending on the presence of other hazards, depending on what you feel like or turns out to be most, you know, convenient, and you get to determine it
Right.
yourself. You can put that in
Right.
there. It's okay. It's just that your customers don't
Right.
like it. They want to be told what the transport classification is. Maybe transport classifications are so complex that you push back and you say, nope, your
Hmm.
responsibility. If DOT audits somebody and they find something's wrong, they expect the shipper to have checked and verified
Hmm.
the classification. They will
Oh,
hold the
yeah.
shipper responsible. But if the shipper says, well, I got this in the safety data sheet, they may go back to the people that wrote the safety data sheet and said, this apparently is wrong, and you provided this to them, and we think you should pay a fine too. Instead of saying to the original shipper, well, you were lied to, we're letting you off the hook. No, they'll fine them for not realizing they were
Hmm.
being lied to, and they'll go back and get, if they possibly can, the people that provided them
Right.
that classification.
Complex, super complex stuff here. And, I think this has been an excellent discussion here. I know there's the nuances that we get in the hazard communication world are plentiful. This is just one glaring example of this, and I'm glad to have Eugene on today to discuss this. Are there any parting thoughts that you'd have for the listeners as far as how we handle this stuff and the world of the hacking that we do in our everyday compliance work?
Um, there are training classes
Hmm.
out there, not many, but there are training classes in transport classification. The good ones emphasize the differences between GHS and transport in the
Yes.
rest of the world. They'll talk about the kinds of things that we've
Hmm.
talked about and the differences. So if you get somebody that's very, very knowledgeable in GHS and the objective criteria, and you add in subjectivity and locations and sizes and all those other things, then the training class doesn't need to be overly long and
Right.
overly complex. It needs to be thorough. I would suggest that you make sure that your safety data sheet authors
Yep.
get trained. And then the second part is once they do, depending upon where a given company ships and the sizes they use, you consider expanding
Right.
Section 14 to accommodate the various permutations. Now, if you've got a computer program that's trying to write stuff out and you're trying to limit the space in Section 14 because you don't want a 22-page SDS, maybe there's going to be pushback. But my suggestion is the more complex your business and the more complex your logistic operations, the bigger your Section
Great
14 ought to
advice.
be.
Yeah.
Get trained, adjust Section
Right.
14 as
Right.
necessary. And what they say about free advice, though, I'm sorry, I don't mean to in any way denigrate the value
Yep.
of your podcast. But I have heard that free advice is often worth what you pay for it.
Well, yeah, this is a great first step into the deep dive we take in these gray areas of subjects that we deal with. And again, you are one of the trusted sources out there. I'm glad you spent some time with us and our listeners and we look forward to having you on in another time and space. But up until that point, come to Gene with these great area questions, subjectivity, all the good topics we talked about today. He is your go-to source, and I'm happy to have you on. Thank you again. It was great talking to you. Have a good one.
It's been
All
an
right.
honor to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Take
much.